The treatment print. Brad's headaches were increasingly getting worse. Some of them left him seeing just dots of light and nothing else. Sometimes he could not even function, having to go to his office, closing the door and shutting the blinds. Finally, his secretary convinced him to see his doctor. "Brad, you have to learn how to slow down," the doctor told him. "But doc, everything has been crazy. My business is booming and I have lots to do. People are depending on me," Brad replied. "I understand," Dr. Jenkins said as he wrote down some prescriptions, "but you will be no good for anyone if you are in the hospital or even worse. Take these for a week and make an appointment." "What are they?" "The headaches. They are warning signs of something worse waiting around the corner." "No, that," Brad said, pointing to the paper that Dr. Jenkins was trying to hand him. "Just some pills to help you relax and sleep at night. I suggest you get a hobby as well." "I don't have time," exclaimed Brad. "Find the time," the doctor stared at Brad. "I'll see you in a week." Dr. Jenkins left the room and Brad finished getting dressed. He walked to the front desk to make another appointment. Sitting there was Mona, his nurse. She asked Brad if he got the lecture on slowing down. Brad asked how she knew. Mona smiled and reminded him that she took his blood pressure and it was high. Brad was amazed as Mona recited the medication that Dr. Jenkins prescribed. Then Mona explained that she was working on her doctorate degree. Her paper was examining certain relaxation methods and their effects on the body and mind. She told Brad that there have been several breakthroughs in this field and that maybe some of these methods would help him. At first, Brad was reluctant. Mona then prodded Brad by telling him that after one session, if he didn't feel any better, she would pay not only for his prescriptions but his next visit with Dr. Jenkins. Brad accepted the offer. Mona suggested that night at 7. Mona wrote down the directions to her house and handed them to Brad with a smile. Brad smiled back as he took the piece of paper from her hand. He left the office and returned to work. Sam, in accounting, needed to talk with him. After that, there was a meeting with all the department heads. Brad could feel the headache start in the back of his head. He barely made it through the meeting. He barely made it through the day. Finally, he left work to ready himself for his treatment with Mona. His head was pounding as he approached Mona's house. Brad was glad that the directions were very good and her house was easy to find. He walked up to the door and rang the bell. Mona greeted Brad and invited him in. They walked into the living room and both sat on the couch facing each other. Mona began to explain in more detail the relaxation methods. "Relaxation methods treat the symptoms, not the real problem," Mona said. "Although these methods are effective, they are temporary. You feel good for a while, but once you return to the source, you are tense again. As you know personally, this can lead to health dangers. A person cannot always ignore the source, but my theory is to provide a personal, more complete relaxation method that relieves the stress at the source, so to speak. You are my guinea pig. Are you willing?" "Is the deal the same?" asked Brad. Mona nodded her head affirmative. "I'm in then. It can't hurt to try something different," Brad smiled. "Great," Mona smiled. "First, I need you to fill out this questionnaire. It will enable me to pinpoint the source of your tenseness so I can design the best combination of relaxation just for you." Mona handed Brad 12 pages of the questionnaire. It was full of situational questions with multiple answers. Brad read the first question. You are driving in your car and come across a burning vehicle with someone trapped inside. What do you do? The answers are: 1. Keep driving. 2. Call 911 and keep driving. 3. Call 911 and stop to help. 4. Stop and help. Are you kidding? Brad asked. No, replied Mona, just pick the answer that best suits you. When Brad finished answering all the questions, he handed the papers back to Mona. She opened her laptop and began entering Brad's answer into it. Brad sat there, his headache still pounding. He asked for an aspirin, but Mona told him that it could jeopardize the results. She told him that it will only take another minute and then they could begin. A printer came to life in another room and Mona excused herself. She came back a minute later, studying the paper in her hand. Brad asked if the paper was the results of his questionnaire. Mona told him it was not only the results but the best combination of relaxation methods to use to help him. Brad was curious, but Mona said she couldn't tell him what the paper said because again it could skew the results. This made Brad a little nervous. Mona saw this and told him that she would explain as much as she could as they went through the process. She brought over 3 candles and asked Brad to tell her which one smelled the best to him. Brad sniffed each of the candles several times and chose the one that smelled of pumpkin. Mona stood up and lit just those candles, then she walked over her home theater system and music began to play softly in the background. As the scent of the candles filled the room and the music played, Brad could feel his headache slightly loosening its grip. Mona came back and sat on the couch with Brad. It has been proven that certain scents and sounds help the relaxation, she explained. Also it has been proven that a good massage helps to relax the muscles. I'd like for you to remove your shoes and socks and your shirt, then lay on the massage table. Brad thought to himself that this wasn't so bad and did as he was instructed. Lying on the table, he was amazed that his headache was slowly disappearing. He made the comment to Mona. She told him that it is the scent of the candles and the background music helping him to relax. She began to rub his shoulders. Brad's back was a tangle of knotted muscles. As hard as Mona massaged, the knotted shoulders of Brad's would not yield. On a research expedition in South America, Mona came across a tribe living deep in the jungle. The medicine man of this tribe would use an oil on his fellow tribesmen in certain rituals. She had asked and was granted permission to witness one of these ceremonies. The medicine man was to bless a hunting party before they left. Rubbing the oil on their bodies, the medicine man had them in a relaxed state of being. The hunters were so relaxed that the medicine man was able to give the hunters a suggestion that their courage in the hunt will protect them from harm. He also gave them an unconscious suggestion that they are brave even in the face of danger and fear. Mona was amazed at how the hunters reacted to these suggestions. These hunters became fearless, even the smaller of them were not intimidated by the larger hunters. Mona wanted a sample of the oil. At first, the medicine man declined. After pleading with him, the medicine man said that he would give her some of the oil if she would allow him to use the oil on her. Of course, she agreed. Mona only remembers being very relaxed after the application of the oil. After her experience, the tribe called her Shabaku. She later found out it meant tree monkey, but when she tried to find out why the tribe's people would giggle and point to the trees. One time she saw a female monkey nursing an infant. When she arrived back home, Mona had the oil analyzed. It was made from plants with mild hallucinogenic properties. Mona was able to synthesize the oil. Mona reached into her pocket and pulled out her secret weapon. This was her first time to use the oil. I am going to use some oil to help loosen your back, Mona told Brad as she put on surgical gloves. It will feel cold at first but then it will feel warm. I want you to try to empty your mind and then let it just drift to some place where you are happy. A small shiver ran down Brad's spine and goosebumps popped up on his flesh as the oil touched his skin. He then felt the warmth and as Mona began to rub the oil in his skin he let his mind go blank. Mental pictures flashed in front of him like a movie moving in fast forward. It started to slow and eventually stopped. The scene was blurry at first, and then slowly came into focus. Brad was surrounded by trees. He could feel a slight breeze blowing on his face. The sun was bright and he could feel the warmth on his skin. He was shirtless. Brad could hear the voices of other people, laughing and talking. He was standing on a path holding a bicycle in his hands, his small hands. The adults walking by him were taller than he was. He realized that he was a boy, just a boy and his bike. Brad jumped on his bike and began to ride. The sensation of the wind blew his hair back, weaving his way through the people that shared the path and pedaling faster. Mona felt Brad's muscles start to relax. Her fingers massaged the oil deeper into his back. She knew that he had found a place. Mona kept massaging Brad's back until all the tense muscles were gone and Brad was completely relaxed. Where are you, Brad? I am in a park riding my bike, Brad spoke in a child's tone. Really? How old are you? Mona asked. 10, smiled Brad. Aren't you in school? Not, it's summer. School is out. Are you enjoying yourself? Mona asked. Yeah, Brad smiled. Tell me about it. What do you see and feel? Brad began to tell Mona how he was riding his bike through the people that are walking on the path in the park. He told Mona how good the sun felt on his shirtless back. Brad told Mona that he wanted to ride faster but the walkers were in his way. He saw an unpaved bike trail and went that way. He was riding faster now and the wind was blowing his hair. He could hear the birds chirping around him. He was pedaling so fast that he flew over a hill. It was kinda scary being airborne and it kinda hurt as he hit the ground again. He was going real fast down the hill. He put on his brakes as he came to a sharp turn in the path. He stopped and he could hear the sounds of a river flowing in the distance. Brad walked his bike to the river. The water looked so cool and refreshing. He wanted to go in but was afraid that someone might take his bike. So Brad sat on bank and put his feet in the water. The water was so clear, he could see fish swimming close to the shore. Mona jotted some notes down. According to the results of the questionnaire, the source of Brad's tension was the responsibility he felt for the business that he had built from the ground up and those that not only stood by him but for those worked for him, especially those that has been with him from the beginning. She noted that Brad's happy place is where he can experience less of that responsibility. Brad's relaxation point is to be a boy riding his bike in the summer sun and hanging his feet in a lake. It feels good, doesn't Brad? She whispered in his ear. She could see the sides of Brad's mouth as he smiled. This is a good place for you, Brad, Mona continued. Whenever you feel the headaches start, just close your eyes and come back to this spot. Yes, Brad answered softly. I'm going to leave you in this happy place for a minute. I want you to explore all its wonders. Mona slid off Brad's back to write down some more comprehensive notes. She could hear Brad sigh a yes as she grabbed her clipboard and began writing. She was pleased with the effect that the oil had on Brad. He was lying on the massage table completely relaxed. She could see the big grin on his face and knew that he was definitely enjoying himself. She wrote on the clipboard to schedule follow-up visits weekly at first, then monthly. As she was feeling good about her experiment and patting herself on the back, Mona had a thought. She left the room for a few minutes, and then she walked back over where Brad was laying and smiling. Brad, it is getting late. I bet you are getting tired with all that writing, she spoke. Yeah, the sun is going down. Time to go home, Brad softly sighed. Yes, Brad. Time to go home, Mona replied. Let me help you. Mona helped Brad off the table. She then led Brad into the bathroom where the tub was filling with water. She sat on the toilet with Brad facing her. She asked him if he enjoyed his day in the park. Brad told her he had a great time riding his bike. He also told her that he almost caught a fish with his bare hands. They both laughed at that. Mona told Brad that he must be hot and sweaty after his bike ride and suggested that he should take a bath. It would help him to relax, and that was why he was here. Brad agreed. Big boys like you can bath themselves, Mona said. If you were a little boy, then you wouldn't have to worry about washing yourself. You could just play in the water and let someone else wash you. Would you like that? Brad stood there thinking about it for a minute, then he smiled and shouted, Yes. Okay, Brad. Let's do this. I will slide your pants down and get you ready for your bath. As you feel your pants and underwear slide down your legs, you will become a little boy getting ready for your bath, and you can play while I wash you. Okay, Brad replied enthusiastically. Mona unfastened Brad's pants and began to slowly slide them down his legs. Brad closed his eyes. He could see his bike. As he felt his pants slide down, his bike began to change. At first, it grew training wheels. He could feel his pants at his knees. As Brad watched his bike, it turned into a tricycle. He could feel his pants around his ankles. A huge grin came across his face. His tricycle was smaller and no longer made of metal. It was one piece of bright red plastic. The oversized wheels were white. The handlebars curved so that they were close to the seat. It was the coolest trike Brad had ever seen. Okay, Brad. Step out of your pants, Mona asked. She could see the big grin on Brad's face. Brad had to put his hands on Mona's knees for balance. From the bunched-up pants that surrounded his ankles, Brad pulled his left foot out, then his right foot. Mona couldn't believe it. Right in front of her was this full-grown man stark naked with a grin going from ear to ear. He didn't seem to care about anything. Mona asked Brad if he was ready for his bath. She was surprised when Brad answered in a voice that sounded like it should have come from a toddler. How old are you, Brad? She asked. This many, Brad said, holding up 3 fingers. Mona was amazed at how young he pictured himself. She asked him if he was ready for his bath, and he nodded his head that he was. She helped Brad slide into the warm water. Then she asked Brad if he would like a bubble bath. Brad responded by clapping his hands. Mona got up and brought back some powdered soap. She poured it in the water and stirred it up. Mona told Brad to do the same thing. Brad got excited as he watched the water foam into bubbles. She told Brad that she had a surprise for him and showed him a small plastic tugboat to play with in the water that her nephew had left. Brad's eyes got big as he saw the boat. He started to push it in the water, making motor sounds. Brad was focused on playing with his boat. He had discovered that his boat would not sink in the water. He would pull it under, let it go, and laughed as it popped back up through the bubbles. Mona could do nothing but smile as she began to wash his back and watch him play. She was about to ask Brad to sit back so she could wash his front when a wave of soapy water splashed from the tub and soaked her. Brad had been so fascinated that his playboat couldn't sink. He watched as the boat floated in front of him. Then with both his hands flat, he slammed them down on the toy, spraying water everywhere. A silence hung in the air as Mona, soaking wet, and Brad, red-faced, stared at each other. Then Mona began to laugh. Brad started laughing too. Mona helped Brad sit back as she finished washing the front of him. Once done, Mona helped Brad out of the tub and dried him off. Once Brad was dry, she took off her soaked blouse and bra to dry herself off. Brad stood there and stared at Mona's naked top. He couldn't help but glare at her breasts. He knew that there was something that he should be doing with them, but he could not find an answer. He put his thumb in his mouth and sucked on it as he concentrated on the elusive answer. By sucking his thumb, Brad felt that he could find the answer, besides it felt good. Mona finished drying her hair. She was about to ask Brad if he had enjoyed his bath. She stopped in mid-sentence. Standing in front of her, Brad was staring at her with blank eyes and sucking his thumb. At first, she was confused. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She then had a theory. Mona held her hand out to Brad. Brad took it and they walked into the bedroom together. She patted the bed to indicate to Brad to climb on it. He did. Brad sat on top of the bed naked with his thumb still in his mouth. Mona thought about putting on another blouse, then thought better of it. Modesty had long gone out the window. "Did you like your bath?" Mona asked. Brad sat there and nodded his head yes. "You liked somebody else washing you so you could just play, didn't you? It fun." Brad mumbled around his thumb. "Do you like someone taking care of you so you can just play?" Brad pulled his thumb from his mouth. "Yes," he said. Then Brad put his thumb back in his mouth. He could feel that obscure answer coming closer. "Would you like for someone to take care of you all the time?" Mona watched as Brad processed this new information. "No responsibilities, no worries, you could just play all the time." Brad showed a big grin around his thumb. "You know what that means, Brad," Mona continued. "You would be just like a baby with no accountability to anyone. Nothing to worry about. Someone would take care of all your needs and wants. Would you like that? Would you like for me to take care of you?" "Bobby," Brad responded. "Yes," Mona replied. "You would be baby Brad." There was the answer that Brad was searching for. He could finally not have to worry about others. He could just play and let another person take care of his needs and wants. Brad watched as the mental picture of his plastic trike turned slowly into a brightly colored mobile with ducks, giraffes, and elephants. The music that had been playing throughout Mona's house was coming from that mobile. Mona watched as Brad slowly lowered himself on the bed with his thumb still in his mouth. He lay naked on his back with his legs spread wide. Brad was smiling. Mona noticed a small droplet of drool dribbling from the corner of his mouth. She couldn't help but think how cute this grown man lying on her bed sucking his thumb looked. She could only smile to herself as she watched Brad explore his body. Mona thought to herself, boys will be boys. She was surprised as Brad began to pee all over her bed. The stream arched up. Acting quickly, Mona grabbed the towel and caught most of Brad's accident. Brad started laughing as Mona stared at him. She couldn't be mad at this adorable man baby in her bed. She found herself laughing too. "Baag gagu," laughed Brad. "Yes baby Brad. You made wet," replied Mona. Brad laughed, babbled and cooed at Mona. She couldn't help but smile at Brad. She began to tickle him and play with him, blowing raspberries on his stomach. She was enthralled with his giggling and his behavior as a baby. She went to get a big beach towel to use as a diaper for Brad. She didn't want another incident on her bed. Mona wiped Brad's. Brad giggled. In a sing-song voice, she asked Brad if he enjoyed that. He giggled even more. After putting the makeshift diaper on him, Mona just stood there and watched Brad as he babbled and moved his eyes, looking at his surroundings with a new perception. She couldn't help herself in being drawn to him. Brad was now so helpless. She had promised him that she would take care of him and she was looking forward to the task, especially when Brad held his hands out to her. Mona climbed onto the bed and held Brad close to her. Brad began to rock him back and forth. She even sang him lullabies. She observed Brad's eyes start to flutter. His mouth's motions were slowing. With a pop-d as Brad fell asleep in her arms. She slowly slid from underneath Brad. She left him sleeping in the bed and went to type her notes in her computer. The next morning Brad woke in the bed. He realized that he was naked but saw that his clothes were hung on a chair in the room. He got himself dressed and followed the smell of food to the kitchen. Mona was fixing bacon and eggs. "Coffee?" Mona asked as Brad walked in. "Yes, please," Brad replied. Mona poured a cup for him as he sat down at the table. "I slept here." Brad was a little confused. "Yes. You fell asleep and I thought it was a good idea to just let you. How do you feel?" Mona didn't want to say too much. She wanted to see just how much Brad could remember. I feel great, never felt better. Brad watched as Mona placed a plate of breakfast in front of him. Mona sat on the other side of the table. She remained quiet, waiting for Brad to give some indication of what he recollected last night. Breaking the silence, Brad said that the last thing he remembered was picturing in his mind of riding a bicycle and sitting on the banks of a lake with his feet in the water. He went on to tell Mona it must have been a dream and woke up in the bed. He asked her why she was naked when he awoke. Mona lied and told him that he must have undressed himself in the middle of the night. Brad just nodded his head and said that must have been what happened. He asked her how it went since he didn't remember much, just lying on the table and having the massage. Mona replied it went well, but there needed to be follow-up visits to see how it worked. Brad agreed that he would meet once a week for a time, and he also agreed to keep a diary relating to the occurrences of the headaches and what happens. A month went by. Brad kept his journal and his appointments with Mona. They met weekly as agreed. When Brad would feel his headaches starting, he would close his eyes. It felt like being in a trance. He would open his eyes and his headaches were gone. He couldn't remember a lot from his trance. All he could recall was a park, a bike, and a lake. The trances only took a few seconds, but when he came out of them he felt refreshed and his headaches were gone. This was verified in the journal that Brad kept. Brad even visited Dr. Jenkins. The doctor couldn't believe how well Brad was doing. He thought it was because of the medication that he prescribed. Brad told him it was just living the good life. Eventually his headaches became less frequent. His visits with Mona became once a month. His journal entries were less frequent as his headaches were subsiding. Mona was pleased with the results of the oil and the progress that Brad had made. Brad's business hit a snag which started the domino effect. Rumors were floating around that his accountant, a longtime friend and someone who had been with him from the beginning, had been skimming the books. As these rumors grew, Brad decided to call in an outside auditor. It was found that these rumors were true, and in fact Brad's business was missing $1.2 million. He had no choice but to terminate his accountant and longtime friend. Brad's headaches came back with a vengeance. He would close his eyes and the headaches would go away, but they were fierce, and the time that Brad stayed in his trance-like state lasted minutes instead of just seconds. More rumors appeared, but this time these rumors were being played out in public thanks to many news services. A reporter saw Brad getting into his car. "Mr. Kinder, is it true that banks have declined your loan applications in order to recover the loss from inaccurate accounting practices?" Brad stopped. He had been trying to avoid the press as they had been hounded him. He decided that this was as good of time as any to confront the rumors. "That is incorrect. Is it not true?" "It is true that I have been in meetings with some banks with a business plan for expansion," Brad lied. He could feel his headache starting up. "And they have turned down the proposal." "No comment. Talks are still ongoing." Brad was getting into his car. "One more question, Mr. Kinder. Why did your friend, Jonathan Peters, fired?" "He wasn't fired. Mr. Peters decided to leave to pursue other ventures." "No more questions. Thank you." Brad closed his door and drove away. He turned the corner and stopped his. He could barely see, the headache was unbearable. He closed his eyes and saw the park, his bike, and the lake. He opened his eyes, the headache still lurked in the back of his head. Brad looked at his watch, 20 minutes had passed. He was late for the meeting. The reporter wasn't far wrong. John was fired and he had been trying to replace the missing money, but all the banks indeed had turned him down. As a last-ditch effort to save his business, Brad decided to sell it to a group of investors. In the past, this group had tried several times to buy him out. Due to the present circumstances, Brad had little choice. Besides, they have offered him a substantial amount of money, and even without him, the business would survive and people would stay employed. The group knew of the financial difficulties the business had in recent months, but they were determined to make a good deal. Brad started his car and drove hurriedly to the meeting. As expected, Brad was 10 minutes late. He apologized as he shook the hands of the people there. He knew most of them, his lawyer and the investment group. He had never met their lawyers, so he was introduced to them. All the gentlemen sat in the chairs around the big table. The lawyers pulled their contracts from their briefcases. The meeting was to be the grand signing of the documents, but lawyers, being as they are, were haggling over a few minor details. Brad could feel his headache sitting on top of his spine waiting to attack. He was concentrating on keeping the headache where it was. This was not the place to close his eyes. There was no telling how long the trance would last. He could hear the lawyers' voices but could not decipher what they were saying. Brad's focus was interrupted by his lawyer telling him that all is in agreement. Brad looked down the papers his lawyer slid in front of him and told him to sign. Brad pulled his pen from his pocket. He could see that his hands were shaking and began scrawling his signature on the dotted lines where his lawyer pointed. Once all the documents were completed, one of the gentlemen pushed a button on his phone. He said something in it, then proclaimed that it was time for a celebration. A secretary entered the room pushing a cart loaded with glasses, ice, and liquor. She went around the table taking everyone's drink orders. The room filled with the aroma of lit cigars. Brad was rubbing his temples and blinking his eyes trying to keep his headache at bay. "And what would you have, Mr. Kinder?" the secretary smiled. Brad looked at her and thought for a minute. "Me want wawa in my baba." A hush fell across the room. Everyone stared at Brad. He knew he had done something wrong. He could feel their eyes upon him. He thought about what he had said and was thinking of how to make everything right again. The silence in the room was taking the air out of it. Then Brad knew what to do. "Please," he smiled. The room erupted into laughter. Brad's face turned bright red. They were laughing at him. He was embarrassed. He did not know what he had done wrong. The laughter continued. People started to point at him. People slapped him on his back. Brad became scared and ran from the room. Mona had taken a week from Dr. Jenkins in order to finish her paper. Sitting in her robe, Mona was pleased with her documentation of her work. She took a sip of her coffee when the doorbell rang. She got up wrapping her robe around her as she went to the door. She was surprised to see Brad standing there. "Help me," Brad cried. "What's wrong, Brad?" She ushered Brad inside and closed the door. "It hurts?" Brad grabbed his head. "You have another headache." Mona led Brad to the couch and sat him down. "Didn't you close your eyes and relaxed? Couldn't in meeting takes too long." Mona opened a drawer on her desk. Mona took out the scented candles she used for their first session. She noticed that the vial of oil was empty. She placed the candles around the room and lit them. She turned the music on and let it play in the background. Walking back to Brad, she noticed that his hands were away from his head and his breathing was slowing. "Feeling better?" Mona asked. "A whittle," Brad answered. Mona was surprised by his answer. "Whittle?" She was more surprised with what Brad said next. "They waffed at me," Brad said. "Who laughed at you?" "People at meeting." Brad began to cry. Mona sat next Brad and tried to comfort him. Brad told Mona everything that happened from the reporter to the secretary. "I said please but they waffed," Brad finished. Mona was astounded at Brad telling of his story in his high voice, using the vocabulary of a 3-year-old. She told Brad that everything was okay. There was no meeting. There was nobody else, just the two of them. She told Brad that there was plenty of time and there was no need to hurry. Drying his tears, Mona dried Brad's tears and told him to just close his eyes and relax. Brad obeyed. Mona left him on the couch as soon as he went into the trance. She dialed a collecto. Sheila was the chemist who analyzed the oil. Speaking softly, she asked Sheila if there was more of the synthesized substance. There was a small amount. Mona asked if she could bring it over. Mona peeked in on Brad and watched as he put his thumb in his mouth. She asked if she could make a stop on her way. Sheila said she could and started to ask questions about what was happening. Mona told Sheila that she was with another subject and when she arrived to knock and be quiet. This was enough to satisfy Sheila's curiosity, so Mona disconnected the call. Mona watched as Brad was lying on the couch. She started to put the pieces together. She sat at her computer and began typing notes to herself. Brad had delayed his relaxation exercise. When he was able to do them, it took a while to have an effect and that effect did not neutralize the headache. It only pushed it back. Brad's mind searched for a way to eliminate the headache, following the path of the treatment that worked. It found it, but the event at the meeting only increased the mental turmoil between the headache and Brad's desire to relieve it. This caused the headache to return with vengeance and Brad's mind of finding ways to combat it, and this mental battle led to the change in Brad's behavior and speech. Mona's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Mona opened it. Sheila asked if she could come in. Mona refused, telling her that any disturbance could disrupt the process. Sheila handed Mona the bags and then gave Mona a small package of the oil. Sheila warned that she didn't have time to contain it properly and Mona should be careful when handling it. Mona thanked her. After closing the door, Mona glanced at the clock and saw that 30 minutes had passed. She walked into the living room where she had left Brad. Brad was awake and standing in front of her. Then it happened. A wet spot formed on Brad's pants. It continued to grow and a small puddle formed around Brad's feet. "I made Tinku," Brad smiled. Mona quickly put the packages down, not realizing that some of the oil had leaked and was absorbed in her hand. She moved Brad from the puddle and told him to just stand there. She went and brought a towel to clean the mess. Once done, she told Brad that she needed to get him put of those wet clothes. Mona took off his shirt and began to slowly remove his pants and underwear. "Bath," Brad shouted and clapped his hands. "You need one," Mona smiled. She was still amazed at seeing a grown man naked like this, with no modesty, and behaving as Brad was. As the oil moved through Mona's bloodstream, she started to relax. She led Brad into the bathroom and began to run the water. "Bua boys," Brad exclaimed. Mona just laughed. She told Brad not to move. She went and looked in the bags that Sheila had brought and found the bottle of bubble bath. When she returned, Brad was still standing in his spot, sucking his thumb. She didn't look at Brad as a subject or even an experiment that had taken a bad turn. She began to see Brad's behavior as natural. Mona poured some of the liquid into the bath. She giggled at Brad's expression of amazement as the bubbles grew in the water. She helped Brad into the water and began to wash him. "Boat," Brad held out his hand. "Not this time, you little monkey." Mona paused. Why did she say that? Why did she call Brad a monkey? She dismissed the thought and finished bathing Brad. Mona helped Brad from the tub and dried him off. Brad was upset that his bath was short and he didn't play with his boat. Mona was more relaxed now. She thought that it was from the steam in the bathroom. They both walked hand in hand back into the living room. Mona laid Brad on the floor. She thought it was natural that Brad should be laying naked spread eagle on her living room floor. She asked Brad if he was still having headaches. Brad held up both hands with the palms out and told her all gone. She told Brad that she had a surprise and would be right back. She went to the bags again and transferred what she needed into one bag. "You want me to take care of you?" Mona asked Brad. "Yes," Brad said as his thumb went to his mouth. Mona reached into the bag she brought with her. She told Brad that it would prevent any more accidents. They both laughed as Brad repeated the word but said accident. Brad's eyes got big as he saw what was in her hands. It was a diaper big enough to fit him. He clapped his hands. "You are going to be my big baby monkey, Brad?" Mona was giggling at his reaction to the diaper. "I can take care of you, no more problems for you to worry about and stress over." Brad closed his eyes. He saw again the mobile playing the music. He watched it as the animals slowly spun around. He could feel all the stress flow from his body. He was totally and completely relaxed and he knew that he was going to stay that way, no more headaches ever. He sensed that Mona would take good care of him and protect him from that pain. He wanted to thank her. He also wanted to touch the animals spinning on the mobile. He opened his eyes to new world that surrounded him, everything was fresh and Brad was seeing it as if it was for the first time. "Da ba guji," Brad said. Mona smiled down on him. She was sprinkling baby powder over his genitals. It didn't bother her that this man was babbling and cooing as a baby with his legs spread wide so that she would not miss a spot. It all seemed natural to her. She was chuckling at the expression on Brad's face. He was enjoying the attention that she was giving. It didn't bother her. Brad's pubic hair seemed natural to her. What caused that thought to come to mind, she wondered. She bent over Brad, taping his diaper. Brad reached up to her. During all this time, Mona's robe had come loose, exposing the front of her. She moved around so that Brad was in her lap. Cradling his head in HR. She remembered the first time, but this time was more intense. Holding Brad in her arms and his sucking her nipple deeper in his mouth. She closed her eyes, flowing with the feeling. Brad started to stir, waking Mona up. The morning sun was shining through the window. She looked down at Brad in her lap and she noticed liquid that had dried and dribbled from his mouth to the bottom of his chin. "Morning monkey," she smiled. Brad looked up at her and began to babble and coo like a 4-month-old. Mona felt his diaper and confirmed that he had wet himself. She slid from underneath him and grabbed the things she needed from the plastic bag that rested beside her. She undid the wet diaper and put it in an empty bag. To Mona, it became natural to see this grown man to be lying naked on her floor playing with his toes. She grabbed some wipes to clean Brad's genitals. "Again. Silly monkey," Mona giggled. "Bg dagad," Brad answered. She tried to get the diaper on Brad but he kept squirming. He laughed at Mona's attempts, knowing that his small efforts were frustrating her. He would giggle and babble at her as she told him to keep still. She blew raspberries in his tummy but that just made Brad wiggle even more. They both were laughing. Finally, Mona reached into the bag and pulled out a binky. She rubbed it across Brad's lips and he sucked it in. It calmed him down enough so that she was able to get the diaper on him and taped tight. Satisfied with her work and knowing that Brad was being good, she got up and walked into the kitchen to make some coffee. Her body felt out of the ordinary but she shrugged it off. She turned on the TV. There was a video of Brad running out of a building. Mona turned the volume up. She was catching the end of the story. One of the morning anchors asked the reporter why did this happen. The reporter answered she didn't know why. The other anchor stated that with all the problems that Brad had faced in the recent month that maybe he was just trying to get away from it all. The other reporter nodded her head and replied that maybe he just needed to get away and relax. They all laughed and then a commercial came on. Mona laughed too. Brad had gotten away and was very relaxed. She went and checked on her little one. Sipping her coffee, she watched as Brad was trying to catch a spot of dust floating in the morning sunlight shining through the window. From the corner of her eye, she saw the screensaver floating on her computer. She went into the room and hit a button. Her report appeared. She quickly read the notes she had typed the night before. She sat down and typed, "More research needs to be done." The treatment print. Brad's headaches were increasingly getting worse. Some of them left him seeing just dots of light and nothing else. Sometimes he could not even function, having to go to his office, closing the door and shutting the blinds. Finally, his secretary convinced him to see his doctor. "Brad, you have to learn how to slow down," the doctor told him. "But doc, everything has been crazy. My business is booming and I have lots to do. People are depending on me," Brad replied. "I understand," Dr. Jenkins said as he wrote down some prescriptions, "but you will be no good for anyone if you are in the hospital or even worse. Take these for a week and make an appointment." "What are they?" "The headaches. They are warning signs of something worse waiting around the corner." "No, that," Brad said, pointing to the paper that Dr. Jenkins was trying to hand him. "Just some pills to help you relax and sleep at night. I suggest you get a hobby as well." "I don't have time," exclaimed Brad. "Find the time," the doctor stared at Brad. "I'll see you in a week." Dr. Jenkins left the room and Brad finished getting dressed. He walked to the front desk to make another appointment. Sitting there was Mona, his nurse. She asked Brad if he got the lecture on slowing down. Brad asked how she knew. Mona smiled and reminded him that she took his blood pressure and it was high. Brad was amazed as Mona recited the medication that Dr. Jenkins prescribed. Then Mona explained that she was working on her doctorate degree. Her paper was examining certain relaxation methods and their effects on the body and mind. She told Brad that there have been several breakthroughs in this field and that maybe some of these methods would help him. At first, Brad was reluctant. Mona then prodded Brad by telling him that after one session, if he didn't feel any better she would pay not only for his prescriptions but his next visit with Dr. Jenkins. Brad accepted the offer. Mona suggested that night at 7. Mona wrote down the directions to her house and handed them to Brad with a smile. Brad smiled back as he took the piece of paper from her hand. He left the office and returned to work. Sam, in accounting, needed to talk with him. After that, there was a meeting with all the department heads. Brad could feel the headache start in the back of his head. He barely made it through the meeting. He barely made it through the day. Finally, he left work to ready himself for his treatment with Mona. His head was pounding as he approached Mona's house. Brad was glad that the directions were very good and her house was easy to find. He walked up to the door and rang the bell. Mona greeted Brad and invited him in. They walked into the living room and both sat on the couch facing each other. Mona began to explain in more detail the relaxation methods. "Relaxation methods treat the symptoms, not the real problem," Mona said. "Although these methods are effective, they are temporary. You feel good for a while but once you return to the source, you are tense again. As you know personally, this can lead to health dangers. A person cannot always ignore the source, but my theory is to provide a personal, more complete relaxation method that relieves the stress at the source, so to speak. You are my guinea pig. Are you willing?" "Is the deal the same?" asked Brad. Mona nodded her head affirmative. "I'm in then. It can't hurt to try something different," Brad smiled. "Great," Mona smiled. "First, I need you to fill out this questionnaire. It will enable me to pinpoint the source of your tenseness so I can design the best combination of relaxation just for you." Mona handed Brad 12 pages of the questionnaire. It was full of situational questions with multiple answers. Brad read the first question. You are driving in your car and come across a burning vehicle with someone trapped inside. What do you do? The answers are, 1. Keep driving, 2. Call 911 and keep driving, 3. Call 911 and stop to help, 4. Stop and help. Are you kidding? Brad asked. No, replied Mona, just pick the answer that best suits you. When Brad finished answering all the questions, he handed the papers back to Mona. She opened her laptop and began entering Brad's answer into it. Brad sat there, his headache still pounding. He asked for an aspirin, but Mona told him that it could jeopardize the results. She told him that it will only take another minute and then they could begin. A printer came to life in another room and Mona excused herself. She came back a minute later, studying the paper in her hand. Brad asked if the paper was the results of his question.